7, the regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny Act for purposes of a markup. I move that the committee report it favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 277 to amend Chapter 8 of Title 5, United States Code to
Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Recognize myself for an opening statement. The Constitution separates the powers of the federal government. It gives only Congress the power to make federal laws, but the administrative state violates these principles. Charged with executing the law, federal agencies have assumed the legislative power. They now impose policy through rules and guidance. Further, the administrative state has little, if any, political accountability to the people whose lives it controls. The administrative state's lack of accountability means that it can impose radical, unpopular policies that could never make it through a vote of the Congress. The regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny Act, or the REINs Act, would be a good step to help remedy these problems. The bill would require affirmative congressional approval for major rules, including those with an annual effect on the economy of at least $100 million. This helps put legislative power back in the hands of the legislature, back in the hands of those of us here in Congress. The bill is a good start toward restoring the constitutional separation of powers and increasing the accountability of policymakers to the American people. I urge support for this bill and yield back the balance of our time. And the chair now recognizes the distinguished member from New York, the ranking member, Mr. Nadler, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, once again, we are gathered here to mark up a bill that would frustrate the purpose of government and would put our constituents in harm's way. The regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny Act, or the REINs Act, is a huge expansion of the Congressional Review Act that requires both houses of Congress to vote and approve for the President to sign any rule from our executive branch that is in progress. The REINs Act would grind the gears of rulemaking to a halt by requiring all major rules to be affirmatively approved by both chambers of Congress. A regulation would be blocked from being implemented if even one chamber declines to pass an approval resolution. The goal of this legislation, quite simply, is to stop the regulatory process in its tracks, regardless of its impact on public health and safety. The bill purports to give Congress control of the rulemaking process, but Congress already has this power and exercises it in a number of ways. For example, Congress can delegate authority to agencies with specificity, thus limiting the scope of the agency's authority. It can impose restrictions on rulemaking through appropriations. It can also influence rulemaking through oversight activities. And if all of these measures are insufficient, we also have the blunt tool of the Congressional Review Act, which allows Congress not only to overturn a rule, but also to bar the agency from ever passing a substantially similar rule. The majority has certainly not been shy about exercising its authority under the Congressional Review Act this year. The REINs Act is not only redundant, but it also creates insurmountable procedural hurdles that would stall the approval of rules of major impact, rules that would be highly beneficial to the public's health and safety. It is important to remember why we have regulations in the first place. Congress sets broad policies, but we delegate authority to executive agencies because we do not have the expertise to craft technical regulations ourselves. Who here knows how many parts per billion of arsenic should be allowed in our drinking water? Is 10 the proper amount? Should it be 5 or 15? None of us here knows the answer, but the dedicated professionals at our federal agencies, many of whom have decades of experience and vast technical expertise, undertake a careful process to protect our health and safety. This process includes numerous procedural safeguards, including public notice and comment. Regulations ensure that our air is safe to breathe, our water is safe to drink, our food is safe to eat, and the life-saving medications we depend on are safe and effective. It means that the cars we drive and the planes we fly have proper safety mechanisms. And when we do not properly regulate, sometimes it means that trains carrying dangerous chemicals can derail in our communities, putting thousands of people at risk. I feel much better about leaving regulatory decisions to the careful study of agency experts rather than to members of Congress who want to substitute their judgment subject to the whims of politics. Republicans have spent decades waging an all-out assault on the regulatory process, trying to add hurdle after hurdle to the ability of agencies to issue regulations that protect public health and safety. Regulations whose benefits consistently outweigh their cost, often by many multiples. If we want to improve the regulatory process, we would consider legislation such as the Stop Corporate Capture Act, which would bring more transparency and accountability to the rulemaking process. But instead, we are taking up legislation to dismantle and destroy the regulatory process, regardless of the impact on public health and safety. Mr. Chairman, one final word about process. If we were to follow regular order, we would have this markup today, and then perhaps the bill would come to the floor for consideration. But consistent with the Republicans' haphazard approach to governing, this legislation has actually already passed the House as part of the majority's reckless default on America plan. That's right, we're marking up a bill that has already passed the House. But this is not just irresponsible legislating, it is irresponsible policy. The majority plans to cut costs by cutting the very protections that ensure our health and safety. I urge my colleagues to join me in opposing this dangerous bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Without objection, the gentleman yields back. Without objection, all of their opening statements will be included in the record. The chair now recognizes himself for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 277, offered by Mr. Jordan Novo.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered base text for the purpose of the amendment. The chair recognizes himself to explain the amendment. This amendment permits the regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny Act of 2023 to also be cited as the REINs Act of 2023. This change more readily allows this bill to be cited by its commonly known acronym when it is passed into law. It is not intended in any way to alter the important purpose of the legislation. I urge support for the amendment and yield back. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from Arizona.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Gentleman has an amendment. Clerk will report the amendment. Gentleman from Georgia reserves a point of order.
Do they know it's 50 million? 50 million.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 277, offered by Mr.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized to speak on his amendment.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I applaud my colleagues supporting the $100 million threshold in the REINs Act. In fact, I initially sponsored the REINs Act a number of years ago and did for several years. I think $100 million does not go nearly far enough. The administrative state has grown so big, its spending has gotten too out of control. Its regulatory authority, unchecked by Congress, has gotten too great for even a $100 million threshold to be sufficient. My Republican colleagues admit we have these two problems, the expansion of the administrative state and spending. They admit that we also have this regulatory environment, which has essentially created a fourth branch of government, as many political science scholars would attest. I suggest we reduce the threshold for congressional approval to $50 million in order to address these problems more fully and further constrain the growth of the administrative state. I know it will mean that we will have to vote more often. We will be called to approve more rulemaking proposals. I'm okay with that. That's our job. That's our job. That's what we're supposed to do. We should be the ones that are approving rules, that are willing to be held accountable. I want to approve rules that make America better, freer, more productive. Now's the time for Congress to regain control of agencies which we have too long negligently delegated our lawmaking authority to. When James Madison talked about tyranny, he often talked about how a legislative, executive, and adjudicative authority were combined into one body. We have done that in Congress over the last 90 years and created a tyrannical, bureaucratic state. I think it's time for us to do something about it. I like the REINs Act at a $100 million threshold, but I think we should be doing more. I want the agencies to have to earn our support. I want to challenge them to write rules that fill needs, that spend taxpayer money wisely and efficiently. I want them to be constrained. I want them to think critically about their rules. And I want the president to want congressional support for substantial actions by his or her agencies. Our founder's system of checks and balances demand that we rein in the administrative state and demand accountability. The smaller rules add up. I worry that we won't have a say in a litany of $99 million rules that will inevitably result from agencies attempting to circumventing the $100 million threshold. My amendment might result in more $49 million rules, but I can tell you that it's going to be a lot harder for agencies to get around that than a $100 million rule. I propose more than 500 bills to curb spending this year because we're spending far more than is authorized. There are more than 1,200 agencies, departments, and programs that are currently unauthorized that we give $500 billion to every year. I think it's time. Oh, yeah, I just got to mention this. I was criticized in the Rules Committee by the ranker because it cost $18,000 for me to introduce over 500 bills. So think about it. He was critical of a legislator for legislating. Yeah. But right here, I am hearing and suspect that my colleagues across the aisle, they're going to be absolutely okay with these bureaucratic agencies continuing to have an unchecked blank check going forward. So I would urge us to adopt my amendment, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman on Georgia is recognized to.
I withdraw my
Gentleman from Georgia withdraws his point of order.
Mr. Chairman, if I might, I actually had a question about the point of order.
Gentleman from, I think, Maryland, but I think the point of order has been withdrawn.
Mr. Chairman?
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I don't need 5 minutes, but I did have a question about germaneness. At the last markup, we had, I don't know, maybe a dozen Democratic amendments were ruled as non-germane because they expanded the scope of the legislative proposal that was underlying it. I think this proposal here clearly increases the scope of what would be covered by this language by dropping the threshold from 100 million to 50 million. And so I raised the germaneness issue again because it seems like that it would be inconsistent with the position that the chair has taken in the previous markup. I yield.
I appreciate the gentleman. The question in the last markup was those amendments added additional issues into the legislation. This one is the same issue, just determining what the dollar amount may or may not be, depending on how the committee decides to proceed with the amendment.
If I might, sorry.
Your 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, it clearly expands the scope of what would be covered by this language. I don't know that the chair used the term issues when we were dealing with this last time around. I believe it was scope was the standard that the chair used in making his germaneness decision. So I would say that this is not germane under the standard that the chairman used at the previous markup with respect to the gentleman yield amendments. I would.
Just to underscore your point, by essentially potentially doubling the number of regulations that would be the subject of this, those regulations would cover all kinds of different topics, all kinds of different issues. So you're absolutely right. By changing this number, reducing it, and therefore sweeping more within the ambit of this bill, it vastly increased the scope of the legislation and is impossibly consistent with the rulings of the chair from just the last markup.
Would the gentleman yield?
It's not my time to yield, but I will yield back to the gentleman.
Yes, thank you. I think you are entirely correct. By the standards the majority used in the last markup when they ruled all those amendments ungermane, this is equally ungermane. But I think we have to recognize that their rulings on germaneness at the last markup were nonsense. And they were partisan and deliberate nonsense. By any normal standard, this amendment is in order. By the standard they used at the last markup, it is not in order. But I don't see that we should hold the majority to a nonsensical standard. I yield back.
reclaiming my time. I appreciate the ranking member's comments. I yield back to the chair.
I appreciate the ranking member telling us that this amendment's in order. I recognize the gentleman from. Mr. Chairman? I recognize the gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me address first the argument that was just made, because I was in the chair when those decisions were made. And I just want to note the obvious here. A change in a threshold dollar amount of a bill does not equate to a change in the scope of the underlying legislation, very much unlike the amendments that were brought in our last session on the bill they're talking about. And we can go back and play the tape if you want to hear the full explanation, but I don't want to eat up all my time on that. I do want to rise in support of the gentleman's amendment for a very important reason. And I think that the American people are behind us here, and I think they would support this amendment for certain if they're paying attention and following what all this is about. Here's the simple fact, and I explain this in town halls back home all the time, and I'm sure some of you do similar things, but we have to acknowledge that the federal government is way too big, and it does way too many things, and very little of what it does it do well. The administrative state has grown exponentially over the recent decades, and it, as stated earlier, has consolidated governmental powers in the executive branch. And what that's done then is it's usurped the proper and constitutional role of Congress, our Article I authority over lawmaking and policymaking. And that consolidation of power has become really very dangerous. It's created an administrative state that is out of control. It's contrary to the separation of powers doctrine in our Constitution, our matchless Constitution, and it diminishes the political accountability of the people who set policy. If you have nameless, faceless bureaucrats who are effectively making law, they are by definition unaccountable. We literally do not know who to hold accountable. The people do not know who to hold accountable. When you have bureaucrats making all the laws, and that's effectively what's happened now, Congress allowed this to happen over a series of decades as the power was usurped. But it creates a real problem. In our system, our matchless system that everybody around the world tries to emulate, the reason it works so well is because we have separation of powers. We have checks and balances. As members of the House, we have to run for office every 2 years. Why? Because we're closest to the people. We have accountability. If we don't do our jobs well, then they'll send someone else to do it. But we can't do that with the administrative state because we don't even know who they are. And so by limiting this, lowering the threshold to 50 million is an essential thing to do. We're going to be 247 years old as a nation on July 4th. We are still a very young nation. You know, if a high school civics student looks at 247 years, they think that's an eternity, but we know that's just a small speck on the span of human history. And we don't know how long our constitutional republic is going to endure. The founders didn't know, but they said there are certain foundations that you have to maintain, and the reason that they were so insistent about the checks and balances and the separation of powers is because they understood that all men are fallen and corrupt, and that power corrupts, and as Lord Acton said, absolute power corrupts absolutely. We are veering towards absolute corruption in the administrative state. That is why so many agencies in our weaponization select committee, why we're so busy, because so many of the agencies that were designed to protect and serve the American people have been turned against them and are being used against the very citizens they're supposed to serve. How did that happen? It's because we allowed our Article I authority to be usurped. So the REINs Act is essential. I think this threshold of 50 million is very reasonable. And I would just close by reminding us of the words of John Adams. He said, you know, explaining the difference between us and what was happening in the monarchy and in Great Britain, he said, you know, we're a nation of laws, not of men. It's the rule of law that defines who we are. That's why our system works so well. And as the great evangelist Charles Spurgeon said, the best of men are but men at best. We better maintain this system of checks and balances. And I think this would be a really, really important step to prevent this death by 1,000 little cuts of our liberty and our oversight and allowing the government to grow so out of control. We wouldn't have a $31.8 trillion federal debt if Congress was more involved in these decisions. And so I'm in full support of this amendment. I think everybody should. And I think, as I said at the outset, if the American people understood and were following this argument, they would absolutely be in favor of the Biggs Amendment. So with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the ranking member.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to be brief. As I said in my opening statement, the several things are the case. Number one, we have delegated, Congress has delegated over the years rulemaking authority to federal agencies because we have not the competence to judge how many parts per billion of arsenic are safe in the air or the water, and a million other things. So we have delegated that power to agencies who hire experts to deal with that. If we don't like the result, if we disagree, we have the Congressional Review Act, which can overturn the regulation. If we want to improve the process, we would consider legislation such as the Stop Corporate Capture Act, which would bring more transparency and accountability to the rulemaking process. I oppose this amendment because it makes a terrible bill even worse.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
No, not at the moment. It would make a terrible bill even worse. The bill now subjects all rules over $100 million, essentially says you can't do those rules. Now it would say for $50 million, that's even worse. And it would make it even worse for the public's health and safety. And now I'll yield.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
Yes.
Part of the legislative process, a very critical part, and a part that we exercise here all the time, is that we rely upon the testimony of experts. I mean, that's sort of the function here. We have hearings, we bring in people of all persuasions in our areas of jurisdiction and judiciary, but we have committees of Congress that would cover every potential field. And so, I mean, the question is, why should we send that authority down to people who we can't hold accountable instead of doing the job ourselves?
Reclaiming my time. We hold hearings. Those hearings are designed to result in bills that we pass and laws, but Congress cannot possibly, no matter how many hearings we hold, no matter how specific we make the law, have the flexibility and the ability to define the various environmental and other dangers. Again, we had a train derail in East Palatine, what was it, Ohio, I think it was.
Palestine, yep.
In East Palatine, Ohio. What regulations, what degree of regulation would have prevented that? We can know in general terms. We can't know in exact terms. What percentage of lead in what was carrying should be permitted in case it got into the atmosphere? We cannot do those things. That's why we have delegated these kinds of specific decisions to agencies which have the expertise, which have a process with public comment on them, and we have given ourselves the power to overturn these regulations through the Congressional Review Act. And that's why this bill would be affirmatively harmful, and the amendment would make it even worse. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlewoman from Wyoming is recognized.
First of all, the non-delegation doctrine is a constitutional provision indicating that the legislative branch does not have the authority to delegate our legislative authority to administrative agencies. So what the ranking member is suggesting is unconstitutional in and of itself. With that said, I'd just like to provide some very specific statistics from the 10,000 Commandments from 2022 published by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Federal spending surged to $6.822 trillion in 2021. These federal outlays are projected to reach $5.872 trillion in fiscal year 2022. The burden of regulatory regulation is equivalent to 33% of these projected federal outlays. Regulatory costs of $1.927 trillion amounts to 8% of the U.S. gross domestic product, which is estimated at $23.99 trillion for 2021. When regulatory costs are combined with federal outlays of $6.822 trillion in 2021, the federal government's share of the entire economy reached at least 36%. If it were a country, U.S. regulation would be the world's 8th largest economy, not counting the U.S., but ranking behind France and ahead of Italy. The regulatory or hidden tax associated with the regulatory burden exceeds individual income taxes by several billion dollars. If one assumed that all costs of federal regulation flowed all the way down to households, U.S. households would pay $14,684 annually on average in a hidden regulatory tax. That amounts to 17% of the average pre-tax income of $84,000. The regulatory tax exceeds every item in the household budget except housing. That means a typical American household spends more on embedded regulation costs than on health care, food, transportation, entertainment, apparel, services, or savings. Trump's total of 2,964 final rules in 2019 was the lowest count since records began being kept in the 1970s and is the only tally below 3,000. During calendar year 2021, while agencies issued 3,257 rules, Congress enacted only 143 laws. Thus, agencies issued 23 rules for every law enacted by Congress. This unconstitutionality index, which is the ratio of regulations issued by agencies to laws passed by Congress and signed by the president, highlights the entrenched delegation of lawmaking power to unelected agency officials. President Biden had the highest number of pages in the Federal Register of over 95,894 pages. In 2021, the Federal Register contained 74,532 pages of regulations. Since 1993, when the first edition of 10,000 Commandments was published, agencies have issued 114,821 final rules. Of the 95,848 final rules issued since the Congressional Review Act passed in 1996 under President Bill Clinton, there's been a revocation of just 20 rules. The Weidenbaum Center at Washington University in St. Louis and the George Washington University Regulatory Studies Center in Washington, D.C. jointly estimate that agencies spent $78 billion in fiscal year 2020 just to administer and police the federal administrative apparatus. At the end of calendar year 2021, 2,094 proposed rules had been published in the Federal Register, 272 of them deemed significant, which the federal government defines as those rules having an annual economic effect of $100 million or more. The reality is that we are not being governed by the legislative branch, by the people who are accountable to the American citizens, to those who are elected pursuant to our Constitution and our laws. It is the unelected bureaucrats that are dictating the laws in this country. I support the REIN Act. I support the amendment. It is time that Congress took back its rightful constitutional authority to legislate, and we need to take it away from unelected bureaucrats who are abusing the power that this body has illegally granted to them. And with that,
Please
I
yield
back.
to me, Ms. Hageman.
Would the gentlelady yield to the gentleman from Arizona?
Yeah, I just want to point out something on pages 9 and 10 of the underlying bill. It negates the argument, oh my gosh, we're not going to regulate anything. This will bring it to Congress. It doesn't mean that there no regulations will be issued. It means that we will be the ones, and we're the ones that get held accountable, and we should be held accountable. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady yields back. The chair, who seeks recognition? The gentleman from Maryland. Oh, I'm sorry. You've already been recognized. That's right.
Mr. Chairman, I thought I was only recognized on the germaneness issue.
I'm sure we can get someone. I recognize you for 5 minutes. I'm sure we can get someone to yield.
Okay.
If you want to go now on the amendment.
Well,
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. Americans rely on administrative agencies to ensure that our air is safe to breathe, that our water is safe to drink, and that our medications are safe. They depend on administrative agencies like the FAA to make sure that all of the rules and regulations to promote safe air travel are in full force and effect. There are so many responsibilities of federal agencies over the years. It has been the American tradition that we have experts making rules to carry out legislative intent, as evidenced by the legislation that Congress passes. Now, I've got 5 minutes to make my comments today. If this was a hearing, I'd have 5 minutes to question a witness. And you can't deal with public safety regulations in such a format as a legislative hearing. It's just simply too unwieldy an operation to be able to get at the niceties of how we're going to protect the health, safety, and welfare of Americans. And so we need federal agencies. And what we're doing today is demonizing what they call the deep state. Anybody in an agency, you're really saying that government is bad. And in fact, it's been the Republican objective for decades now. Low taxes, less government. This is really getting to what they really want, which is a society of no rules, no regulations, only the strong survive. Corporations, the rich and wealthy, get richer and wealthier. Working people, poor people trying to make it into the middle class are perennially confined to poverty. And this is what my friends on the other side of the aisle want. This is the kind of society that they want to see. And so the REINs Act is a big step forward in that direction, and that's why I oppose the REINs Act. I oppose this amendment that has been posed. America is in jeopardy of defaulting on our debt because House Republicans are holding our debt hostage. Now imagine if every administrative decision required explicit approval from Congress. Congress does not move that quickly. Agencies would lose their ability to function, and the world would become a more dangerous place. And to put into, to give you an example of how Congress operates, I mean, at the start of this Congress, it took my friends on the other side of the aisle 15 ballots to select a speaker, and selected the weakest speaker in the history of the country, now trying to negotiate a default scenario with an unwieldy conference. You just can't get it done. We would never have any action on protecting health, safety, and the welfare of Americans if we left it up to Congress. The REINs Act also may be unconstitutional because its effect is nearly indistinguishable from the one House legislative veto that the Supreme Court has already held to be unconstitutional in INS versus Chadha. So in short, the REINs Act would hurt American citizens, and so I strongly urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment. I'll yield to the chair, to the ranking member.
Thank you. I just want to point out that we can't pass 13 appropriations bills by September. Do we really think we can carefully consider and vote on every regulation, on poison, on specific provisions to prevent airplanes from falling out of the sky? I think the question answers itself. I yield back to the gentleman. I thank him.
I yield. Yield back.
Yeah, gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The last point by the ranking member, actually, I don't think it makes his point. I think it makes ours. So one reason that Congress can't do its job is because it has handed over its job to others to do. If the circumstances were different and Congress were in a position to be necessary to achieve those results, Congress would change its practices in order to get there. I can tell you that under this Republican majority, there will be in the House prompt passage of appropriations bills on all the relevant departments. And it is interesting that how fundamentally it is a sort of a political mantra of my friends on the minority side of the aisle to say that they're protecting our democracy. And I don't know if we all have the same common understanding of what they're referring to. I assume they mean the constitutional republic that exists by design. And to that point, there are a few things. The ranking member said, well, if you pass this bill, it would reduce the efficiency of passing laws. You couldn't possibly pass laws fast enough to satisfy all needs. But we don't have a monarchy. A monarchy would be one very efficient way to pass laws. The king simply decides. And there are many, if you look at executive orders, that would like to go that direction. Or you could want a technocracy. He said, well, Congress speaks only in very broad terms, we leave the details to experts. Well, I mean, who says? One problem that we often see, if you look at the West Virginia versus EPA, is Congress speaking in broad terms often leaves ambiguity in the language. And that is often a product of insufficient deliberation and care in the design of the statute. Congress needs to do its work carefully in order to give enough guidance that people know what the law is without hordes of experts, so-called experts, filling in the gaps. By the way, that doesn't mean we can't take advantage of expertise. Congress can be advised by experts, should be advised by experts, certainly would be, is advised by experts, but the decision maker must be accountable to the people for another fundamental principle to be observed in our lawmaking, at least as by design, which is the consent of the governed. And this idea that regulations only deal with details, that was the terminology the ranking member used in his argument, is a little bit like the debate that's entered here on germaneness. Germaneness is sort of at the very margins, it's an elastic concept, but certainly we cannot say that our administrative agencies in their regulations have been limited to details. And that's what this gets at. This amendment, by the way, a lot of the debate about the amendment is not limited to the amendment, but the amendment proposes the idea that it wouldn't even take a regulation that's going to have a $100 million impact in the economy to be major, to be of significance, to require, to make appropriate Congress's attention. It should be $50 million. With that, I readily agree. But by no means in practice have our administrative agencies been limited to details. They dominate the legal landscape. And since they dominate it, ipso facto, they have displaced the predominant role that Congress is designed to have in a way that is inefficient. It is a bicameral legislature. You must pass the law twice because it is designed to prevent laws from being passed so rapidly and ill-advisedly that the people are oppressed by them. It is a feature, not a bug. And to say that we want to move away from that can by no means be reconciled with the notion of protecting our democracy. In one respect, though, I agree with comments from the minority. The gentleman from Georgia said we have a tradition. It is not our constitutional design to turn over our lawmaking authority to agencies, but it has become, I don't know if I even want to term it a tradition, but it certainly has been a practice since about 1940, and it is out of control. And it is like an 80%, 90% issue. The American people understand it and agree that it must be corrected. Sorry, I didn't save much time to yield to anybody. I will yield in the 12 seconds I've got.
That's fine. Gentleman yields back.
All right.
The gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really can't believe this bill is being offered again as a serious piece of legislation. The majority's position is that this bill is needed to ensure that Congress has more checks and balance to stop regulations promulgated by any administration, while ignoring the fact that any regulations issued by an administration must first have as their purpose to implement laws that Congress has already passed. So it's just not true. Congress has multiple legislative avenues to review and reverse regulations issued by an administration. We can hold hearings. We can offer public comment. We can disapprove major regulations before they take effect. We can rescind regulations under the Congressional Review Act, and in fact, we're considering 3 such measures this week. And we can pass legislation to change laws or regulations that we disagree with. So to say that this is some kind of noble effort to empower Congress is disingenuous, and it diverts attention from the disastrous consequences that this bill would create. Today's legislation would ultimately prevent the federal government from issuing the regulations it needs to protect and defend our nation and the American people in the modern world. Any new regulation would have to be passed by Congress in order to take effect. Think about that for a minute. In a Congress with a House majority that can barely agree on anything, including whether to keep the government open and pay the United States legal, already incurred debts, Congress would have to approve every new major regulation from every federal agency. And if that doesn't scare you, think about the fact that the Senate, hardly a model of expeditious legislation, would also have to pass every regulation. Congress struggles every day to meet the most pressing needs of the American people. As the ranking member noted, Congress hasn't managed to pass the appropriations bills that it's required to in about a decade. There are not enough hours in a day or a year or a congressional term to have Congress weighing in on every regulation needed to implement the laws that we do pass. The REINS Act would effectively nullify all new rulemaking by any president, Republican or Democrat, and it would grind government operations to a halt, which may be the real purpose here. Imagine an FDA that can't issue new drug regulations, an EPA that can't keep our drinking water clean, and a VA that isn't meeting the needs of our veterans. Imagine a Department of Transportation that can't enforce safety standards for cars or trains or, God forbid, airplanes. That's what the majority has proposed, and it's a dangerous vision for America. But since the chair has already offered an amendment to the title of this bill, I would suggest that a more accurate acronym would be formed if the act were renamed the Republican Agitators Inflicting Nonsense on Us Today, or REIN Out. And that, I would suggest, is how we should dispose of this bill, as a REIN Out. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
I'd be remiss if during this markup I didn't talk about the history of the REINS Act and where it came from. A brilliant man named Lloyd Rogers, who's a constituent of mine, grew up in an orphanage in Kentucky where he met the girl that would later become his wife. They were married for 65 years. He was a veteran. He served during the Korean War. And then he came back home and he was a county judge executive in Campbell County, Kentucky. And in his retirement, he became concerned about the drift in government from the legislative branch to the executive branch. So he came up with this idea that really isn't novel. It's the idea that our founders had, which is that all the laws should go through Congress. And so he came up with the REINS Act, and he went to his congressman. I wasn't the congressman at the time. The gentleman before me met with Judge Lloyd Rogers, retired Judge Lloyd Rogers, and took his idea and brought it back to Congress and put it through Leg Council, and that's how the REINS Act came to be. It was a citizen activist who was concerned about the structure of his government, having defended it during the Korean War and having served in local government. He was passionate enough to put this bill together. And so his name is Lloyd Rogers, and I'm sure he's watching this markup right now because he's very engaged. What I hear from the other side of the aisle, arguments against the REINS Act, one is that, well, we've got a CRA, we don't need the REINS Act. We've got a Congressional Review Act. But the Congressional Review Act is inoperable on about 95%, maybe 98% of the regulations that pass, because the Congressional Review Act requires the president who promulgated, the president's administration promulgated a rule. It would require the president to sign on to cancel his own rule. There's only a narrow window of opportunity where the Congressional Review Act has ever been able to be used, and it's very rarely because it has to act within a certain amount of time. The administration would have to change during that period of time, and that's why the Congressional Review Act is not suitable. It also turns, as Mr. Bishop pointed out, the legislative process on its head. Instead of requiring concurrent majorities in both chambers, to agree to an idea, it requires, the Congressional Review Act requires concurrent majorities to disagree with an idea that which is presumed to be a law, even though it's just a rule that the executive branch has promulgated. And we should get away from calling them rules. These are laws. They're not rules. The pistol brace so-called rule, you get 10 years in prison for violating that. Give me a break. That's not a rule. That's a law. So the other argument that I hear from the other side of the aisle is that Congress is so dysfunctional that we can't be trusted with lawmaking. Oh my gosh, what if there's an emergency or something? Congress is just incapable of writing laws effectively. I reject that. If you give up on the idea that we are the lawmaking body, then you've given up on this republic and the structure that that our founding fathers put in place for our people to be self-governed. But I just want to close by thanking Judge Lloyd Rogers for introducing this bill to his congressman.
Gentleman yield?
And I'm going to yield back to Chairman Jordan.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I think he's exactly right. The fundamental question is who decides? The, quote, experts, the technocracy, as Mr. Bishop described, or the elected officials? The elected officials who answer to Lloyd Rogers. Who's going to make the decision? That's the fundamental question here. I may not know, we may not know how many parts per billion is necessary. We may not know that, but I do know one thing. Regulations and rules that impact the economy to the tune of millions and millions of dollars and impact the 800,000 folks I get to represent, that's important, and they get to talk to me. They get to talk to Lloyd Rogers gets to talk to Thomas Massey. That is how our system works, and that is the fundamental question that we have to deal with, not just on this bill, but on so many things. We have deferred to the, quote, experts, the experts who think they can run our lives and never be held accountable. That is what this legislation is all about, and I appreciate the story and how this idea came into being from Mr. Rogers, and I yield back to the gentleman.
Would the gentleman yield now?
Well, no, and Lloyd Rogers doesn't get to talk to the faceless bureaucrats. Exactly. He gets to talk to his elected representatives. Now I yield to Mr. Biggs, 15 seconds.
I'm going to go fast. If you've ever been into Senator Mike Lee's office, you can go in, and he has a very visual demonstration of this. 14 feet high, that's the annual regulations, about this high, 6 to 8 inches of what Congress puts out as laws. That's wrong.
Gentleman's time is expired. Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes, I think, the gentlelady from, Ms. Dean, gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to the amendment and to the underlying bill. The REINS Act would grind the gears of rulemaking to a halt by requiring congressional assent to the major rules before they can take effect. Thinking about grinding things to a halt, I can't imagine why we are considering this again today when the majority party is right now threatening to grind our economy to a halt as we wait on this nonsensical negotiation with the majority party. This is a crisis that never should have happened, but they like to grind things to a halt. And what happens when that happens is we hurt our constituents. My constituents are worried that the REINS Act threatens the health and safety of all Americans who rely upon administrative agencies to ensure that our air is safe, that our water is safe to drink, that our food is safe to eat, and that life-saving medications will depend on safe and that they depend upon are safe and effective. The REINS Act is based on a false premise that regulations harm economic employment growth. The data shows the exact opposite. With that, I just wish the majority party would focus on that which is important to the American people, safety for all Americans in their health and in their economy and in their climate. And with that, I yield to the gentleman from Maryland.
I thank you. I just had a couple quick points that I wanted to make. One, as someone who's worked on the Hill and actually run an administrative agency, it was a state agency, but we were implementing the Telecom Act. I got to say that the types of hearings we do are dramatically different from the types of hearings that you do in an administrative proceeding. We had hundreds of hours of testimony from people who are experts in their fields, engineering degrees, technical economists, all of that stuff, things that we just don't do with the hearings that we have. We can change that, but I got to say, in the 35 years I've been dealing with Capitol Hill, I've never seen us do hearings like that on the House or the Senate side, for that matter. I also wanted to raise this quick point with respect to constitutionality. I think there's a clear question as to whether this provision is in line with Chadha, the Supreme Court opinion. It doesn't appear to be to me. I took a look at the constitutional authority statement that came with the introduction of this bill. It cites Article 1, Section 8, and that's Provision 17, which is the necessary and proper clause, which really doesn't seem to have much to do with what we're trying to talk about here. By contrast, Chadha bases its decision on the legislative veto on Section 7 rather than Section 8, and talks in terms of the need, to my colleagues who are making constitutional arguments and the importance of following the Constitution, the importance of following the document as it was drafted by the founders. And the point that they make in reaching that holding, in part, is that there are only 4 points in the Constitution where either one house or the other has a role where it can do something on its own, either initiating impeachment, having a trial after impeachment is initiated, confirmation of appointments, and ratification of treaties.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
I will.
On that point, I think it is
Actually,
an interesting issue.
It's her term.
Oh, I beg your pardon. Whose time is it?
Well, I'll yield to you in her absence. Go ahead.
So just to get to that question. So Chadha said you can't have a legislative veto. You can't have something take effect and then the Congress by resolution say, a joint resolution say no, because it violates the presentment clause, right? You're not tendering something the Congress has acted on to the president. But isn't this different? And I've tried to look real quickly. I don't know the answer, frankly. Is there any state constitutional law where somebody's maybe taking a shot at this? Because this is different. It's a condition on the effectiveness of regulations. It's not, in other words, something else has to happen before it becomes law.
I'm reading it a little differently. I think what we're trying to do here is essentially amend the CRA and give a second bite at the apple. So it's the legislative veto after the statute's been passed, but then you can basically go back and limit the reach of the statute unilaterally or unicamerally, I guess. And so the issue I think here is in twofold. One is there's no explanation given with the introduction of this bill as to why it's constitutional. And I think it's clearly inconsistent with the spirit of what Chief Justice Berger wrote in Chadha with respect to, and I apologize for running over the time there, but inconsistent with the point that Chief Justice Berger made, which is there's a constitutional approach to dealing with this. We tried to circumvent that with the CRA. My colleagues on the Republican side are saying that's insufficient, but this isn't the option that was permitted by the opinion in Chadha.
Gentleman's time, or gentlelady's time has expired. The gentlelady from Indiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was listening to this debate, and I have some things I agree with the other side, that Congress is not doing its job. Over 90% of our spending is not authorized by Congress, which is our primary duty to authorize spending, and we're not doing our job. So maybe if we have to really spend more time looking at what's happening, maybe we'll start actually doing the important job for the American people. And as a matter of fact, the House majority did pass legislation related to debt ceiling, and it's right now the Senate majority that is not passing their bill, and I think they need to be held accountable because we did pass legislation and Chuck Schumer has to be accountable. Where is his bill? And that's a question should be asked. And then if we think about it, the administrative state grew so much, and it has the power to rewrite laws and now they adjudicate laws that even Justice Elena Kagan, in her recent opinion, which is justice who was appointed by President Obama, she wrote about, and she was referring to FTC, that FTC knows a good deal about competition policy, but nothing special about the separation of powers. And I think we have to really start thinking about it. Who are the real representatives and what we're allowed to do, to the other branch to write laws on our behalf where people don't have an ability to get rid of the people or even have an input, that maybe not representing their opinion. And we're not expert on every issues here, but ultimately if we need to have experts, we can bring them. Agency can bring, their, regulations to us, propose rules, and they can, talk about that. But we also need to hear from real people on the ground because we're not legislating for them. They are executive branch to execute the policy the American people want. And if people don't want the policy, the only way they can voice their opinion is through us, through our branch. And if we are not doing our job, people become very, powerless. And if we can see with the growth of the government, the power of the people decrease, and large corporations getting richer and richer, and now we have oligopolies and oligarchs controlling almost every sector of our economy. And this is very dangerous what we have, because we are turning into the country where all of the power sits in Washington, D.C., and our founding fathers were very afraid of that. So I think our branch should get our act together and start legislating for the people. So I think it's a good legislation, it's a good step forward, but I think we need to do even more, because if we are not going to be doing our job here, then we shouldn't really not be elected to these positions. We should just stay home and not waste taxpayers' money coming here and just doing like talking heads, doing presentations. We're here to legislate on behalf of the people, and people have such a frustration. We actually have a lower approval rating than president does, okay? We can complain about Brett. Congress has a very high disapproval rating, and rightly so. So I hope people will pay attention more what's happening here, and I think we need to support legislation like that. And I support this amendment and support this bill, and I will yield my time to the gentle lady from Wyoming.
Thank you. I think there's just an absolute fundamental difference in philosophy and a complete misunderstanding on the other side of the aisle as to how agencies actually work. We're continuously hearing about the EPA keeping our water safe and our air safe and things like that. The EPA doesn't keep our water safe or our air safe. Those duties are handled by states and municipalities. The Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't manage wildlife. The states and landowners manage wildlife. Using the EPA as an example, the EPA does not focus on clean water. It instead wields its powers trying to dramatically expand its authority in order to take control over things that it has absolutely no legal authority to manage. I'll give you an example. Under the Clean Water Act, it only applies to navigable waters of the United States. Yet I have had lawsuits with the EPA where they've attempted to define irrigation ditches as navigable waters of the United States and brought enforcement actions against farmers who've done nothing more than clean out their irrigation ditches. That's the problem that we are facing. That's where the courts have had to intervene, is that our agencies have been taking more and more power well outside of the statutory authority that has been granted to them by us. And it's through such things as the Chevron deference doctrine that courts have then deferred to their interpretation or misinterpretation of the statutes that they are allegedly applying. What this law does is it just simply states that the legislative branch will legislate, nothing more and nothing less.
Time of the
I yield back. Thank you.
time of the gentlelady has expired. The chair now recognizes Ms. Jackson Lee, gentlelady from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for giving me this very brief moment. I am delighted to hear of the rising voices that are concerned about the American people. That means that we're all going to rush to the floor today under martial law and raise the debt ceiling, stop the default. That is the evidence of my friends on the other side. They are standing up for the people of the United States. They're standing up for 30 million veterans who lose their medical appointments. They're standing up for parents who will lose Head Start seats. They are standing up for military personnel who won't have housing or food, substance They are standing up for Social Security recipients and Medicare persons and Medicaid recipients. That's a good thing. So maybe we can finish this markup, convene on the floor, and stop the default. But when it comes to the interpretation of the REINS Act, it is a inexplicable response to the three branches of government, because there are three branches of government: Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3. And they are to work with the respective responsibilities. With an election and the leadership of the head of state, the President of the United States, comes obligations, responsibilities, and benefits. And that is the process of being able to utilize the process of a regulatory structure. And as my friend from Maryland said, in the course of state regulatory structures and federal, there is a large amount of hearings, evidence, witnesses. There's the response that the American people allowed after a rule is promulgated. You have a time to provide comments. That's not seen much with respect to these kinds of legislation. In fact, the REINS Act, that has been introduced almost as many times as I've been in the United States Congress, and no one wants to hear me say how long that is, has never gone further in the Senate than a hearing. That's as far as it's gone. And as I understand it, in Congress, there are two bodies. This will be not a stop sign, but a tsunami against any functioning need that the American people have. And I highlight precisely the amount of dangerous toys that have been kept off the streets because of the regulatory structure, or baby formula that have been vetted over and over through the regulatory process to stop babies from dying. So to have a regulatory structure with three branches of government, where the Article 1 branch stops all regulation, good and in between, to wait on them for a vote, when my colleague has just said of the overall reputation that Congress has, I don't see to the work of good members who come here every day, have taken an oath, and want to do their best. Not even to my friends on the other side of the aisle. So the collective vote of confidence, I separate out from hardworking members. But the member has already said what our general image is, and you want to give us the authority to run the government by literally a tsunami of opposition, stagnation, ineffectiveness, not getting to where we need to be? Because that's what you're claiming that you will overcome if you use this law. And my view of it is that you will just stop government in its tracks. And frankly, I believe in government. I believe in local government, state government, even in opposition to some of the things that they're doing. I think we can do good if we do it together. And it is amazing to be here in America where the entity that you call on a rainy day, or fire, or tornado, or even in California, an earthquake, the United States of America. And what good is it to stop this nation from doing its patriotic duty, its response to its people, to come when they are in need? To those who may have some difficulty with some of the laws,
Gentlelady's time's expired.
that is the nature of our business, Mr. Chairman, and I just say democracy demands that we oppose the REINS Act. I yield back.
Yes, ma'am. Gentlelady yields back, and Chair recognizes Mr. Roy from Texas. 5 minutes.
I thank the Speaker. I noticed there's been a lot of comments about, this being dangerous. This is dangerous. This empowerment of Article 1 in the Constitution, the people's House and the Senate, it's dangerous to empower Congress. I want to remind the American people that it is your representatives that you hired to come to Washington and represent you that are sitting here in the House Judiciary Committee, a committee charged with defending the Constitution of the United States, that is looking at you and all of this country and saying, we would rather empower the administrative state under Article 2 in the Constitution than do our job to defend the Constitution of the United States as your representative. That is what your representative is saying to you. And they're saying it emphatically. They are saying it with passion. They're not even just ignoring it, they're actually fighting to give more power to the administrative state, more power to the bureaucracy, more power to Article 2, under a Constitution specifically designed, fought for, to ensure that wouldn't be the case. That gives you a glimpse into the problem that we face today. That an all-powerful government is somehow preferred. That an all-powerful government with bureaucrats unchecked by the people's representatives is the preferred state in the 21st century in America by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. There's been a lot of pointing at the REINs Act as being dangerous and a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth of the calamity that we face with respect to the debt ceiling. I would remind my colleagues and the American people that in the legislation put forward by Republicans, Limit, Save, Grow, that we're fighting to cut the inflationary spending by $1 trillion in year one and $5 trillion over a decade. Our Democratic colleagues want to keep the status quo of record inflation and record spending. We want to cut the spending of the woke federal bureaucracy that's at war with the American people, that is targeting former presidents and targeting the American citizenry, interfering with their ability to live free and prosper economically. We want to limit that simply to pre-COVID levels, something that polls at 76%. Our Democrat colleagues want to expand it. We're fighting for reliable energy and for the working class and hardworking American families, but our Democratic colleagues want to preserve their fat cat subsidies for unreliable energy to the wealthy, to the elite, to corporations and to Chinese communists. 90% of subsidies going to billion-dollar corporations, 80% of EV subsidies going to individuals making over $100,000 or couples making over $300,000. That is your modern Democratic Party, the party of corporate subsidy. We're fighting for the plumber with no student loans and the veteran that sacrificed for the nation. Democrats are bailing out people with master's degree in gender studies. We are fighting for poor and middle-class Americans that are already targeted by the Internal Revenue Service at higher rates. Black Americans 3 times more, poor 5 times more. Democrats, not yet. Democrats want to expand the IRS to go after those Americans even more. We are fighting to reassert Congress's role right here in this committee. We're debating this matter over an executive branch pumping out new regulations that cost hundreds of billions of dollars. Democrats want to empower these faceless bureaucrats. We are fighting to restore the dignity of work in this country. Our Democratic colleagues want to continue to destroy families and communities by spending billions to keep Americans at home. We simply want to restore the work requirements that Bill Clinton signed and Joe Biden voted for, and our colleagues can't even sit down to agree to that which was already accepted previously by our Democratic colleagues. We are fighting to preserve an American dream that is increasingly out of reach for Americans. Our Democratic colleagues want to destroy that dream. And here we debate the REINs Act, designed very specifically to pull back the regulatory state. And I would just add, with respect to the student loan issue, remember that it was Speaker Pelosi who said, people think the President of the United States has the power for debt forgiveness. He does not. He can postpone, he can delay, but he does not have that power. That has to be an act of Congress. And here we are with our Democratic colleagues in the Judiciary Committee yielding that power, not wanting to reclaim that power. I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm frankly gobsmacked by the logic being used by the other side to argue that somehow democracy demands that we defeat this legislation, which is designed to empower the people through their elected representatives under Article 1. The idea that somehow by permitting this bill, we would threaten our commitment to clean water or clean air or safe drugs, ensure that benefits that people depend on are delivered on time. The argument essentially is that Congress should not be trusted with determining such things. And in doing so, they argue that the people who elect us should not be empowered to determine such things. Because by passing the REINs Act, you actually do empower Congress. You empower the elected, those who elect the members of Congress to make those decisions. So what does this bill really mean? God forbid it should mean that we're actually here more than 4 days a week. God forbid it should mean that we actually vote on more than a few bills a day. But I'm ready to work, and it may be hard for some members to adjust to on the other side, but I would say that we should do this for the people we represent to ensure that these regulations that are promulgated by a bureaucracy that is unresponsive. The Department of Health and Human Services from 2001 to 2017 issued 2,952 rules. 77% were unconstitutionally issued without a principal agency officer approval. So nobody accountable to the people signed off on these regs. Of the Food and Drug Administration final rules, 98% were invalid. So we've got an unelected, unaccountable bureaucracy issuing thousands and thousands of rules, and the American people are unrepresented. So
would the gentleman yield for a question?
This legislation is important for that purpose, and for those who were upset about the bill that was passed by this body to actually address the debt limit, you may not have liked the bill, but you can't deny that this body passed the bill. In fact, this is the only body that passed a bill, and you also can't deny that none of you voted for it. So the crisis that is occurring belongs completely, the crisis blame belongs at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue and the other end of the hallway in the Senate for their failure to put forward any kind of proposal that could pass muster in the Senate. And with that, I'm happy to yield to the gentleman for a question.
In your view, why is this bill constitutional under the Supreme Court principles enunciated in Chadha?
The bill is constitutional because it retains those powers which were delegated to the administrative agencies in the first place. It's within Congress's authority to take back those powers which were delegated. So I see no problem with the constitutionality of it, and I'm happy to yield to the gentleman from Arizona for his comments as well.
Yeah, thanks so much. So in Chadha, you had a kind of a bizarre situation where a bill was taken up in Judiciary Committee, but not ever taken up. I shouldn't say it was referred to, but it was removed from Judiciary and was taken to the floor for a vote. Now, what Chadha turned on was that particular piece of legislation actually was removing a regulation that had already been put in place, and it was doing so without bicameralism, without presentment. What this bill does is completely different. It effectively blocks a regulation from becoming effective. That's very, very different than taking regulation that's there and without bicameralism and without presentment, then stepping in. That's why this bill, it doesn't even fall under Chadha, because just the process that we've had here. This does not allow a single house. It requires the bicameralism, and it actually kind of, in a way, presumes that regulation doesn't take effect until we approve it. That's why the language of the approval is actually set forth in the REINS Act itself. I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired, and Chair recognizes Mr. Liu of California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The arrogance that I've heard from some members across the aisle is astounding. Let me just put it out to you this way. Do you want members of Congress to decide if a particular drug cures pneumonia? I mean, I know we're like all that. No one here has any idea. You want the experts and doctors of the FDA to do that, right? Do you want members of Congress to determine if certain brake systems on cars work or not? I mean, I know we're all that, but we have no idea about that. You want people at the National Highway Transportation Safety Agency to look at that. Do you want members of Congress to determine if a particular airplane is worthy for flight in commercial airspace? I know members across the aisle think we're really smart and we should be doing all this stuff. Or do you want the experts at the FAA who know what they're doing to look at this? Let's go back to reality here. We're in a modern world. There are lots of things members of Congress simply do not know. We don't have the expertise. We rely on federal agencies, and they do a pretty damn good job. I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield? Would the gentleman yield?
The gentleman.
The gentleman yield, Mr. Liu?
Yielded back.
Well, I did yield back, but if I could reclaim that, I'll give it back to you.
All right, I'll let you do it this time.
Thank you. I'll yield to Mr. Johnson.
Well, Chairman, I mean.
I yielded to Chairman.
Thank you. I've been meaning to ask this question of the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Massey. He indicted, in effect, the Congressional Review Act and said it was useless. Would the gentleman be interested in helping repeal it?
No, I said it's inoperable for about 98% of regulations.
So would you be interested in repealing such an inoperable
No, I'd like
law?
to amend it with the REINS Act.
Okay. I yield back to the gentleman.
Would the gentleman yield?
I yield.
Yes, we talk about Congress taking over the rulemaking apparatus of the federal agencies so that we can bring it back to the people who've elected us so that they can have an impact on the regulations, which they already do, by the way, through the notice and comment period associated with promulgation of rules. But once a rule has been put in place, then the agencies hear from consumers, they hear from stakeholders, they hear from businesses, they hear from other governmental agencies seeking to be in compliance or asking questions about a particular rule. Do my friends on the other side of the aisle think that their offices are set up to address the many phone calls and inquiries that are coming in from all of the stakeholders about a rule that Congress might promulgate? Do we actually think that the legislative branch has the capacity to administer a rule? I mean, that's nonsense. Come on, people, let's wake up. This is about defunding the federal government. This is about putting in place an apparatus where every man is for himself, every woman is for herself, and by the way, women are not equal to men in that kind of a society. There's no protection for women, no protection for babies, no protection for anyone's health, safety, and well-being. It's just open season by the corporations and the wealthy. That's what my Republican friends are advocating for with this change. Is one step in that process, and we've gone too far. It's time for America to wake up and realize that government is of, by, and for the people. It's us, including the people who who man those agencies. Those are our relatives, those are our friends, those are our neighbors. We're working for the common good, not just for the sake of wealthy corporations and wealthy individuals. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Van Drew, is recognized.
You know, I almost can't believe I'm hearing this, so I'm gonna, as best I can, in the way that I do, try to straighten this out a little bit. This has nothing to do with thinking that women are inferior. In fact, quite frankly, this bill has nothing to do with a responsible debt ceiling. But what folks on the other side are doing, again, as they continue to do, is let the American people who are watching this on TV look at the shiny object over here, because we don't want them to see what the real deal is. I've served at every level of government. I've been a mayor, I've been a councilman, I've been a county commissioner, I've been a state legislator in the Senate and the House. And let me tell you, I talk to a lot of people. If there's anything I do in life, is I get out in the street and I talk to people. And there aren't a lot of people who think, boy, the regulatory process is great. You know, dentists and doctors aren't saying, I love the way that they're regulating me because it's really helping patients, because it isn't. Small businesses aren't feeling that way. People who are trying to work in the workaday world, who work for other companies, aren't feeling that way. And my friend, Mr. Johnson, he talks about the big corporations. They're able to deal with it because they're big, they're powerful, they have a lot of money, so they can deal with this excessive regulation. We do have a responsibility in Congress. We're not going to be administering every minor issue that comes along and have an administrative branch in each and one of our congressional offices. What we are saying is something that other people call sometimes legislative intent. I don't know how many times I've seen a bill passed in Congress. I've seen a bill passed in the House of the House in literally the state of New Jersey or any state, and it doesn't represent what the people want, and it doesn't represent what the legislators want. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the way it works. We work hard. We go out. We talk to people. They tell us we need to do something. We pass a law, and then you need to have an appropriate action with that law, not the stuff that we're doing now where we literally just go forward, pass a law, and then whatever a particular regulatory group wants to do may be very different than the law we passed, very different than what the people want. And people also mentioned that, we were talking about the responsible debt ceiling and talking about our bill, and somehow that got brought into this. I don't know how. Let me just say that Republicans believe that women are totally equal. I don't know how that got brought into this. I don't know how this bill would hurt women. I don't know how it would hurt babies, the ones trying to protect babies. And you know what people want when you talk about a debt ceiling? Damn it, do you know what people want? They want us to stop spending. They want a responsible debt ceiling. They want our government to control itself. They don't want it to waste money. And when it does spend, they want it to spend on things that protect the American public and that protect our American country. But we go astray. I hear things that are so far astray. That's not what this bill does, the things that you're saying. It doesn't do any of those things. What it does is make sure that literally the laws that we pass in the country we have reflect the values of the people who live and work in this great United States. And they reflect those values through their Congress. And if their congressman or congresswoman isn't doing that, they lose the damn election. They lose the election. And then we move on. That's the way we work. But not some, high-end regulatory group that doesn't have to listen to everybody, that tells you how to live your life, how to legislate, how to do every part of the government and how it should function. That is not how it was meant to be. That is not what we want. It is not what the American people want. And if anybody wants to go out and walk the streets with me and talk to some folks and ask them if they want more regulation, do they believe we have too much regulation? They will all tell you that we do and that they're tired of it. It doesn't mean we don't need some regulation. But no, I want to finish this up. I'm sorry. But you know what? The bottom line is regulation is obviously a necessity, but good government and listening to the people of America is why we are here. It isn't to have regulatory agencies run our lives and do things to us that we never intended and don't want. So we do have a voice in it. This is America. People have a voice, and we have a voice. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Buck.
I thank the chair. Mr. Roy, I wanted to visit with you about a few of the comments you made earlier, if you're willing to engage with me.
Yes, sir.
I'm wondering, do you know approximately in the last few Congresses that we have served together, how many bills passed by suspension?
Well, I don't know the number, but it is a large number.
In the hundreds?
Hundreds, yeah, hundreds of bills by suspension.
And other than our friend from Kentucky, most of the people in the House vote for those bills that pass by suspension.
I might have the second most number of no's to my friend from Kentucky, but it was pretty high. And by the way, we objected to a lot of that in order to protect the American people.
Right, and make sure that we had the time to read those bills before we voted for those bills. But if there was a common sense regulation that was passed by the administration that cost more than $100 million, would it be fair to say that that bill could be brought under suspension fairly quickly, passed, and we would have the result where Congress, Article I Congress, saw that and certainly a drug that's going to save lives?
It's certainly possible to do that under the rules.
And isn't it true, or let me just ask you, I won't do a leading question, but when the Magna Carta was signed, did it require the Parliament to yield to the King, or did it require the King to yield to the Parliament?
It was fairly revolutionary in the transformation.
And isn't our Constitution based on that same concept?
It is.
And isn't Article I of our Constitution dealing with legislative power because our founders believed that Article I was the most important article in the Constitution?
Absolutely.
And aren't we on a hill overlooking the executive branch because we are supposed to be overlooking the functions of the executive branch? Isn't that the plan that they came up with to make sure that the visual was there, that the White House is lower geographically than Congress, the White House looks up to Congress, and there is a mall that people can gather on and petition Congress. You can't walk into the White House and get through security. You can walk into your member's office, knock on the door, and ask to speak to your member. You can't go to the Supreme Court and ask to speak to a Supreme Court justice. You can in this Congress. We are accessible as opposed to the administration. And isn't that what the REINS Act is all about, is asking people, bureaucrats, to understand that we're responsible. We've got the power of the purse. We're responsible to the people, and they should come to us if they have a need for an expensive regulation.
Yeah, the gentleman from Colorado is correct, and that is what is so extraordinary about how my colleagues on the other side of the aisle just seem to just whisk away the whole purpose of a republic. The whole reason that we have a republic where we're supposed to represent our constituents and do so in such a way that we are restraining a burdensome, powerful, and potentially tyrannical executive branch. It was literally why our system was created, and all we're trying to do here, and by the way, was supported on a bipartisan basis in previous years. This passed on a bipartisan basis in 2017. Only now do our colleagues believe somehow standing up for Article I over Article II is going to be dangerous, in their words.
And is this REINS Act, does it apply equally to a Republican administration and a Democrat administration?
It does and should.
And are there subcommittees set up in the House so that subcommittees could hear these very important, very expensive regulations and make recommendations to the body?
Absolutely. And by the way, to the arguments of saying there's all these experts over the administrative state, I would posit that that's part of the problem. But if they're going to bring their expertise, they can present that in summary form and say, here's why this regulation is necessary, and we can make a decision in subcommittees or committees as to whether or not it's worth $100 million and doesn't step on the rights of our citizens or doesn't spend money that we don't have. We can do that.
And my friends on the other side of the aisle keep talking about a democracy, and you keep talking about a republic. Could you tell me the difference, please?
Well, and it seems like that is completely lost in this town, that we created a republic on purpose so that those of us who represent our constituents can come here and make decisions that we think is beneficial for the republic, and keep in mind the laws, keep in mind the Constitution, and make those decisions as representatives of the people, not through the direct decisions made by the people. I would make one note on that point. I had to go through that decision-making in January of 2021, as did you, and make a decision that I had to then go explain to the people of my district why I made a choice, because that's how this works in a republic.
You want to yield?
Yes.
I'll yield to the gentleman from Louisiana.
In 6 seconds, democracy is 2 wolves and a lamb deciding what's for dinner. The founders were afraid of that. It's not majority rules, it's constitutional republic. I yield back.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madison pointed out that when all the powers of government are concentrated in the same hands, you have tyranny. That's why the founders meticulously divided the powers of government. Those are the checks and balances that we all learned at school, or though some of us seem to have forgotten them. All legislative powers herein granted are vested in a Congress of the United States, not some of the legislative powers, all of those powers. Congress makes law but cannot enforce it. The president enforces law but cannot make it, and an independent judiciary resolves its disputes. The founders wanted every law to be made by representatives of the people who were accountable to the people. They wanted every voice in America heard through their representatives before a law was made. They wanted it to be hard to make law. They split the legislative branch into 2 houses and gave those 2 houses different perspectives so they'd even argue with each other. The modern regulatory state puts all of these powers back in single hands. An unelected agency writes the law, then it enforces the law that it has just written. And if it accuses you of violating that law, you have to answer to the agency in a court run by that agency without a jury, and the agency keeps the fines it assesses on you. Is there any more profound threat to a democracy than that? 10 times more laws are written by the regulatory agencies today than by the people's representatives. Americans now have 10 times the chance of being hauled into an administrative law court for breaking an agency regulation than they have being charged with a statutory crime where they have the full protection of the Bill of Rights. My only problem with this bill is that Congress is supposed to make all law. The president decides whether to sign or veto it. This bill still has it backwards. The president's agencies make law and Congress then approves it, but at least it's a step back from the precipice. Now, to Mr. Liu's question, do you want Congress making these decisions or leave it to the experts? Well, we all know the saying that to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Relying on experts without taking into account all of the factors outside of their expertise is dangerous folly. Democracies don't always make the best decisions, but they make the best decisions that are acceptable to the most people. We've just endured the madness of experts, lockdowns and mandates the expert told us would spread the slow of the disease. And we now have study after study documenting that their measures not only failed to do that, but did incalculable damage to the economy, to the education of our children, to the public's overall health. They needlessly cost lives who delayed health screenings and treatments, drug and alcohol-related deaths, increased suicide rates. No representative voted for these measures. The regulatory state simply imposed them. Lord Salisbury put it this way more than a century ago. He said, "No lesson seems to be so deeply inculcated by the experience of life as that you never should trust experts. If you believe the doctors, nothing is wholesome. If you believe the theologians, nothing is innocent. If you believe the soldiers, nothing is safe. They all require to have their strong wine diluted by a very large admixture of insipid common sense." That is why we have a Congress, to weigh all of those opinions and to sort through them. You know, experts are there to advise us from every perspective, but it's then our responsibility on behalf of the people to sort through their perspectives and advice and chart a course that takes into account all of the issues at hand and be accountable to the people for those decisions. In 1848, Lex de Tocqueville issued this warning that I think is as important to us today as it was to his audience so many years ago. He said, "The trait which best describes socialists of all schools and shades is a profound opposition to personal liberty and scorn for individual reason, a complete contempt for the individual. They unceasingly attempt to mutilate, to curtail, to obstruct personal freedom in any and all ways. They hold that the state must not only act as the director of society, but must further be master of each man, and not only master, but keeper and trainer. For fear of allowing him to err, the state must place itself forever by his side, above him, around him, better to guide him, to maintain him, in a word, to confine him. They call, in fact, for the forfeiture to a greater or less degree of human liberty, to the point where, were I to attempt to sum up what socialism is, I would say that it was simply a new system of serfdom. And Mr. Chairman, throughout American history, that party has not changed this fundamental belief. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from, the question occurs on the gentleman from Arizona.
Mr. Chairman, before you proceed with the question, I would like to proceed with a question, but I've been asked to do this, so without objection, I'll withdraw my amendment.
Gentleman withdraws his amendment. The question now occurs on the amendment. Oh, okay. Okay. But the question in front of the committee is the question now on the amendment, but unless you want to amend that. Okay.
Without objection.
Oh.
Without objection, I'll withdraw.
Without objection, it's withdrawn.
Where we go? Yeah. Okay. Gentleman from New York.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.